Welcome to Text Readings with Greg Stafford, where we progressively work our way through the ancient biblical records so that we can become more familiar. Educated, where it concerns the ancient people of God, the God whom we worship, the God of the Bible, the God Jaho. That's the anglicized form of the name that we use. But the most simple form of the name that we also use is Jah, again an anglicized form of the Hebrew and Greek versions of the name Yah. So we are interested in learning about that God, about the things pertaining to that God, the things that the people associated with that God are said to have done, according to the best available evidence and records that we have. And one of those records is known as the book of 2 Kings. We did a text reading the other day from the book of 1 Kings. And we only did one, and we're only going to do one from 1 Kings at this time, because we're using the translations I've done to date. And I've only translated a small portion of each of these books, 1st and 2nd Kings. We're going to be reading 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 15 through 17. Before we get to the reading, let me just bring you up to speed on what takes place immediately preceding this account. In the start of the book of 2 Kings, which I highly encourage you to read, we read about the kingship passing to Ahab's son. We talked about Ahab yesterday in relation to Elijah and 1 Kings 18, 21 and 22. And so at the end of 1 Kings, Ahab dies. Ahab being the one who married Jezebel and who brought all the prophets of Baal and started worshiping Baal to light. And so Elijah had to confront them. So Ahab has died and his son Ahaziah takes over. And rather than looking to the God of the Bible, Jah, the God of Elijah, Ahaziah, when he gets injured, he falls through a roof and he gets injured, and he sends his servants to seek counsel from the servants of Baal-zebub. Many of you have probably heard a form of that name very similar in the New Testament, were the Jewish enemies of Jesus, the ones who didn't accept him. Not all Jews were the enemies of Jesus, but the ones who didn't and who rejected him and even blasphemed him, attributed the powers that he demonstrated to Beelzebub, which is basically the same as Baal-zebub. And so Ahab's son Ahaziah looks to Baal-zebub rather than to Jah. And so Jah recognizes this, and he gives a prophecy regarding Ahaziah's death because he failed to look to the God of Israel and instead looked to this foreign god. Right? This is the whole problem that began with these foreign gods in Solomon has continued through to this point. And you see it over and over again in the records of 1st and 2nd Kings. And so it's been continuing on through to this point. Eventually Elijah dies, or he's caught away in a storm. And he passes on basically his position to Elisha. Elisha means my God is salvation. So Elisha follows in the mold of Elijah. And you see a lot of things take place, right? In fact, you see, as you read the account from 2 Kings 1 through the reading today in chapter 6, you see a lot of things that Elisha does that are similar to some of the miracles of Jesus, including the ability to replicate food from food, to have a limited amount of food or oil, produce a lot. And that's exactly what we see, of course, in the account of Jesus involving the fish and the loaves. They had a little, and they ended up with a lot. So this is something that is part of the powers that Jaho gives to his servants at different times. We also see that Elisha is able to even raise the dead. Right? First, he foretells the birth of a child to a woman with an older husband, so she doesn't believe in it. Kind of like with Sarah and Abraham. But Elisha prophesies about this child And she eventually has the child. The child dies, though. So then she begins to, bemoan the death of the child, go to Elisha. And you see the different ways that Elisha goes about handling these different miracles and the things that are involved. There was even one instance where it reminded me almost of the story of King Arthur and the sword in the lake. Although it precedes it, right? It's not legendary. It's what we believe really happened. But where one of those with Elisha loses his axe head in the river, and he tells Elisha about it, and Elisha asks where you lost the axe head. And once he points it out, the servant, the person with him, he throws a piece of wood there, and then the axe head floats up, and he tells him to grab it. So that made me wonder whether or not the Arthurian legend was in some way based on that. So you get a lot of these stories and events that are described in these accounts. And we get to a point where the king of Syria has a chief of the army. What ends up happening is the Syrians do a lot of raids, and they end up capturing a young Israelite girl. And they take the girl back to be a servant to the king's wife, or the chief of the army of Syria's wife. And so she eventually tells her mistress, right, the one she's serving, the little Israelite girl, about Elisha when she learns of Naaman, the army chief's leprosy. So she starts talking about how in Israel there's this prophet Elisha who can do a lot of different things, including healing. And so they send for Elisha. They eventually go to Elisha. Naaman comes to Elisha, but he doesn't come out, but he tells him, go bathe in the Jordan 7 times. And Naaman's like, you mean I came all the way out here? I could have bathed in the rivers of Syria, which, he held in higher account than the Jordan. And you want me to go do this common thing? And so he leaves away from Elisha, whom he had trusted at that point based on what he heard, without intending to do what Elisha told him. And then his servants tell him, well, look, if he had told you to do something like complex or detailed, you would have done that. So why won't you do this simple thing? And so Naaman thinks, okay, I'll go ahead and do it. And so he goes and he bathes in the Jordan, and he gets cured of his leprosy. He bathes in it 7 times, and he gets cured. So he wants to give Elijah, some material gifts, but Elisha refuses them. But Elisha's servant, Gehazi, chases after Naaman when he learns that he could try to get some of those gifts for himself, which is what he does. He gets some silver and garments, but he doesn't realize Elisha already knows what he's doing, just like he knows what's happening in Syria and elsewhere, because he's a prophet of Jah. The angel of Jaho is there with him. And in fact, the angel of Jaho speaks as Jah several times, and the account refers to him as the angel of Jehovah, Jaho. Just like we've read about in numerous other accounts, right? This is the prince of the army here. This is the Joshua 5 angel here. This is the Exodus 20 through 23 angel here. Right? This is Michael, the prince of Israel, who fought with the devil over Moses' body, who's been here, in my view, the whole time. The same Michael that appears there in Daniel, who is the only one who would stand with Gabriel at that time. In any case, I find it interesting when the angel of Jaho is referred to in these different accounts, because it just strikes me as the same angel who's been there this whole time. And so he's the one who's really telling Elisha what's going on and directing all the affairs, punishing the people, doing what Jaho instructed him to do. He has his name within him. He has that authority. So once Elisha finds out about what Gehazi does, right, then he gives Naaman's leprosy to him. And so we have to always be cautious, never to put money or material things ahead of spiritual gifts. Then we get to a point where Elisha and the sons of the prophets, who are prophets, right? It's a Hebrew idiom when it says sons of, just like with sons of God. It denotes members of the class that are described. And so the sons of the prophets are referenced numerous times in these accounts as prophets, people who are intending or with or involved with people like Elisha. So they go out to build different housing structures. And the king of Syria realizes that Elisha is telling the king of Israel his plans as they attempt to attack Israel and cause all this trouble. And so he asks, well, how is this happening? How are they finding out what we're doing? And someone tells, well, they have a prophet, Elisha. He's telling them what's going on. So then eventually the king of Syria sends his army after Elisha. And that brings us to our account. Let's take a look. 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 15 through 17. So we're now at the point where Elisha, all these things had happened with Naaman, the Assyrian army chief. But nevertheless, the king of Syria is still attacking Israel. And he now knows about Elisha and that he's the one who's able to tell the king of Israel what's been happening. And so now they're at a point where they've surrounded the city of Dothan, where Elisha and the sons of the prophets are at this time. So they've surrounded the city, and they're planning on, taking out Elisha. And so this is where our reading picks up. We'll start with the Hebrew account. Sometimes we read the Hebrew translation and the Greek translation together. Sometimes we just separate them, like in the First Kings account. I read the same verse from both translations together. Today, let's just read the Hebrew straight through, and then we'll read the Greek account straight through, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so the Syrian army is surrounding Dothan. Elisha and the sons of the prophets are there. Here's what happens. Verse 15, Hebrew translation. Then the one serving the man of God began to rise up early in the morning in order to get up and to begin heading out. But behold, an army was surrounding the town with horse and chariot. Then his young attendant began to say to him, that is to Elisha, "This is terrible, my lord. How will we get out of this?" Verse 16, Hebrew translation. Then he, that is Elisha, began to say, "You must not be afraid, because there are many more who are with us than are with them." Verse 17, then Elisha began to pray, and he began to say, "Jaho, now open his eyes," so he begins to see. Then Jaho began to open the young attendant's eyes, and he began to see. And behold, the mountain had been filled with horses and fiery chariots all around Elisha. So it shows, doesn't it, that, even though you could be around someone like Elisha, or even in the New Testament, like with Jesus, right? And you can see all kinds of miracles and powerful demonstrations that indicate Jehovah's blessing or presence or spirit. But as humans who are still imperfect, we can lose our faith. We can become afraid. And so it helps make more sense of certain accounts as well, like with the Exodus, right? When they saw all that demonstration of Jaho's power, and yet how quickly they lost their faith. But there are always people who will hold their faith, whether it's Elisha, whether it's Moses, whether it's Jesus, so that if we become afraid, we can have strength. Now let's see what the Greek account has to say. Then the one serving Elisha rose up early in the morning to get ready so he could head out, but behold. Right? So imagine yourself in this town, right? Even with someone like Elisha, you have all this strength, confidence. You get up, the whole town is surrounded. A whole army is surrounding you. The one serving Elisha rose up early in the morning to get ready so he could head out, but behold, a powerful army was gathering around the city, even horse and chariot. So the young attendant said to him, "O Lord, what shall we do?" Verse 16, then Elisha said, "You must not be afraid, because many are those with us, more than those who are with them. Verse 17, then Elisha prayed, this is the Greek translation, prayed and said, and when I use the divine name in the Greek translation, since we know in the later copies of the Septuagint, which I'm translating because they're more complete, contain abbreviated titles for the divine name, just like we find in the later New Testament copies. It's not what's in the original Septuagint or earliest Greek copies or in the Hebrew Aramaic text. So that's why I put the divine name in brackets, in addition to translating the term that's actually in the copies of the Septuagint I'm translating. So Elisha prayed and he said, Lord Jaho, open the eyes of this young attendant so he can see. Then Jaho opened his eyes and he saw, and behold, the mountain completely full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And so, the account goes on after this reading to show how they end up blinding the eyes of the entire Syrian army. They don't kill them all, but they lead them to Samaria. And then eventually they send them back to their home. But, there are times when Elisha or Elijah will call down fire, like in earlier accounts of 2 Kings, when Ahaziah sent men to try to bring the prophet to him, and he wouldn't go. Eventually he went, when the right servant came to him in the right manner, right, with the right demeanor. But the first few times, he said, they addressed him as a servant of a true God. He says, well, if I'm a servant of God, let fire come down and eat you men up. And that's exactly what happens. Of course, there were less people there. There was a chief and then 50 men each time. Either way, in this case, the army that surrounded the city was blinded, led away, and then spared. But it shows us very clearly, or reminds us, right, not to be scared when we may feel certain ways, or be concerned that we don't have as many people with us as other people do, right? How are we going to get out of this place? We're just a few. They have this whole army. What are we going to do? Open your eyes and look beyond what you can see, and remember the one we can't see, the one who guides all of these things, both what we can see and what we can't see. But if you're like me and you trust in the God of the Bible, and you believe that he's with you, no matter how many or how few, just remember to open your eyes and see what you can't see. Because there are a lot more who are with us than with our enemy. And even though we may be few at different times, we may think we have many and then realize we only have a few who we can trust at certain times. There are a lot more that we can't see that Jaho uses to protect you and me. When we're doing his will, when we're trusting in him, and when we recognize that if we just keep going and we don't give in, he will protect us no matter how few or how many we are or can see.